Sir, could you start with your name and your job title, please?
Daniel Gallan. I'm a freelance cricket journalist. I work for The Guardian, The Telegraph, Cricket Monthly, and whoever else is paying.
I've got you on to talk about raw meat-eating Afrikaners, which is where you start your one of your more recent pieces with The Guardian about fast bowlers in South Africa. Take me through the raw meat-eating Afrikaners. And was it Athers who said it on air? I'm trying to remember. No, was it Jonathan Agnew who said it?
It was Jonathan Agnew and it was Andy Zoltzman. It was during the second ODI between South Africa and England in Manchester. I don't know when it was, a few weeks back. And they were wondering why there's a seemingly endless supply of South African fast bowlers, dating back, certainly, well, they were talking about it since readmission from Alan Donald to Fanie de Villiers, Pollock and Teeny, Steyn, Morkel, and now this impressive pace battery that has just dismantled England. And it was a throwaway comment from Jonathan Agnew, but he said, it must be their endless supply of raw meat-eating Afrikaners. Naturally, that got a few laughs, and things like seam position and bouncy wickets and favourable conditions were sort of cast aside as three people on commentary with their very British accents spoke about South Africa in these very simplistic and frankly pejorative terms. And it was a line that was cut from the piece, but I couldn't help but think of mustachioed imperialists twirling their facial hair in pith helmets, planning their next raid on the Boer Republic. And it just got me thinking, apart from getting me a little pissed off, and I tweeted about it, and a few of my Afrikaans followers got very angry about it. They certainly do not like it when the English are cynical or deride or reduce the Afrikaans community to knuckle-dragging thugs, essentially. I thought, okay, well, this is a great opportunity to explore exactly why South Africa have an impressive bowling attack. Since 1992, 4 of the top 10 wicket-taking seamers are South African. Broad and Anderson provide 2 of the English. No other country has more than 1 in the top 10 in this time. In that time, they've got the best average, the best strike rate. And batters in South Africa have a lower average in this time than I think of anyone else apart from Ireland to have staged a test match. So clearly, whether it's the amount of biltong these guys are eating or anything else, since South Africa have rejoined Test cricket, they've got the best fast bowlers.
The interesting thing about that is when you're in South Africa, I remember Sean Pollock telling me that Neil Wagner was a proper Dutchman, and then I think that was probably Nortje's kind of breakthrough series. I think he struggled in India in his first Test series, and then played well against England. And then he said a similar thing about Nortje. So it's that kind of attitude of, especially when you talk about the Afrikaan, fast bowlers. I used to write this before I even knew about the sort of Afrikaan legacy of fast bowling. But I used to write that Andre Nel would, bowl uphill into a wind with a piano on his back. There is that sort of thing. But the thing is that not all these bowlers are actually Afrikaners. In fact, I'm going to put it out there that Vernon Philander and Kagiso Rabada are not particularly, and some of them are very English as well. So it's not just this Afrikaners thing, but there is, I think it's fair to say, there is a reputation within South African that Afrikaner men, big, broad-shouldered, sort of guys, do have is it a different mindset? Or is it different physicality? I don't really know, but they do have a different reputation than other South African men, even if it's all kind of gets away in the wash when you come away from South Africa.
Yeah, I think. Look, it was Charles Langer. Like I said, it was Charles Langerveld who called Arnold Verkeer a proper Dutchman. A Dutchman being a derivative. Well, a Dutchman being a hangover of the Dutch colonists to sort of birth the Afrikaans culture. I think it matters who's saying it. Charles Langerveld, a coloured man, and coloured, for those who don't know, could loosely be described as mixed race in South Africa, although it's like a capital C. It's not the way Americans would use the term coloured. Charles Langerveld, a coloured man, his ancestors were oppressed by Afrikaans people and English-speaking white people. So I think him using the term is a little different than Jonathan Agnew with his Oxbridge accent. I think it sort of resonates in the air a little differently. But you could look. It's not entirely wrong, is it? I spoke to Alan Donald for this piece that has kicked off our conversation, and he rightly points out that you need to be a physically imposing character to bowl fast. You mentioned Vernon Philander; he was never quick, but I'm looking at the top. James Anderson, Glenn McGrath, Stuart Broad, Dale Steyn, Sean Pollock, Mackay Tini. These are impressive athletes, and you've got to be fit, you've got to be strong, you've got to be tall, you've got to be lithe. And the Afrikaans community, like many communities around the world, take great pride in their physical prowess. It's partly why the South African Springboks rugby team has won 3 World Cups. And, the South African ethos is our big guy will beat your big guy. And he won't necessarily beat it through skill or a hot sidestep. He's going to run over you, and you're not going to be able to run over us. And that psychology translates into the cricket. A little less so, because for so long cricket was the game of the white English-speaking population. It's also got the Indian, South Asian population play it a lot, and so does the coloured community. Slightly smaller frame, so it's less so there. But I think you're right, Jarrod. I think there is something to it where that raw meat eating Afrikaner, that mindset as well as the physical prowess does influence the proliferation of Afrikaans quicks. I mean, Arnold Nokia is the only white member of Arnold Nokia and Marco Jansen are the only 2 white members of the bowling arsenal, and they are both Afrikaans. Is that a coincidence? Maybe not.
But then when you do start to look at it, it's quite clearly, and I'm not saying that there isn't a proud tradition within the Afrikaans community of fast bowlers, sort of a modern proud tradition. And South Africa certainly had fast bowlers before the Afrikaans community got involved. Peter Pollock and Neil Adcock and Mike Proctor and, all those sorts of, guys that came through originally. But when you do look at it, a bit like South Africa itself, it's not like, I suppose the best way of putting it, it's not like a region of Kenya that produces long distance runners, or Jamaica producing sprinters or anything like that. The ethnic background of these people is so diverse that it has to be more to do with conditions and probably maybe training and also maybe mindset than anything to do with the Afrikaans community directly, even if they have a tradition within that tradition, a separate tradition inside the broader one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course, and it's even harder to say that it's just conditions, right? Because if every single region in the country produced fast bouncy wickets, you could say, okay, well, someone from Cape Town or someone from Durban would be able to produce that as well. But Vernon Philander grew up in the seaming wickets of Cape Town. Sean Pollock grew up in KwaZulu-Natal, the Durban region, that isn't necessarily very bouncy and as quick as Pretoria or Johannesburg or Bloemfontein, where Alan Donald came from. So conditions obviously play a role. We know that like Australian surfaces, it offers a lot more bounce, but it also offers seam movement more so than Australia. So it's almost the South African bowling conditions are quite a hybrid. They offer the bounce and pace and carry, which any fast bowler loves, but they also offer seam movements. And I think that lateral seam movement means that bowlers have to figure out different ways of getting batters out, and they have to adjust their lengths as they go around the country. So if you are successful on the domestic circuit, say you're Sean Pollock, you're growing up in KZN, you have to hit a different length in Durban, you have to hit a different length in Joburg, you have to hit a different length in Cape Town. But you still have to hit it quick. And I think that's the difference between Australia and England. So in Australia, I imagine you can hit the same length around the country, maybe the gabba a little bit different, but you could probably hit more or less the same length and you can hit it hard. Whereas in England, maybe I'm wrong. You'll know more than me, but I think the perfect storm of the variety of pitches in South Africa isn't so extreme like it is here in the UK, but they're disparate enough that it broadens the skill set of the bowler. So if you can come through the domestic setup taking wickets, I think you're well suited to taking wickets around the world, perhaps more so than any other bowler from another country.
Well, I think if you let's look at the five major countries who I suppose outside of Asia who have produced really good fast bowlers, right? So New Zealand and England, generally you have bowlers who pitch it up. and you don't have a lot of very fast bowlers who are consistently successful, right? And that's because it's really skill-based conditions. And so you do end up with a lot of bowlers who are far more skillful and maybe sometimes struggle to translate outside of their country. New Zealand's worked their way around that. England hasn't, right? I always thought that West Indian bowlers had a huge advantage because they had to play on ragging pitches one week, and then they had to play on Sabina Park the next week, right? So if you're going around the Caribbean and you're bowled one spell in St. Lucia, one spell in Guyana, and one spell in Jamaica, three completely different pitches and ways that you have to bowl. Australia, if you look at the way since the front foot no ball has happened, what's happened is bowlers in Australia just keep getting taller and taller and taller. Now, everywhere in the world that's happened, but I think in Australia you probably have the most consistently tall bowling lineups in the world, and that that probably goes back to Bruce Reid. It's been a long time since Australia's had shorter fast bowlers, right? Even if they're slower, sometimes they're a little bit taller. I think the one difference is in Australia, spinners still feel, even if the numbers don't always back it up, spin is pushed in Australia so that you always want to have a spinner. There's always a thought to look after the spinners. South Africa, after readmission, I mean, spin is such an afterthought, right? The cricket world has changed. South Africa has changed. They come back in. And I think that in South Africa, maybe because you don't have that genuine bounce, you probably have to produce people who are quick, because they have to be able to scare people a little bit. And then you also need that ability. I mean, Rabada's a perfect thing. Sometimes I think about Rabada and I'm like, I don't actually know what his main skill set is, right? And you think about that and you go, that's ridiculous, because he might end up being, one of the greatest bowlers in Test cricket history if he keeps playing the game, right? But there's no obvious skill set there. Whereas if you look at the Australian bowlers, who are the most comparable to South Africans, it's like, we knew exactly what Glenn McGrath did. We knew exactly what Pat Cummins did. We knew exactly what Mitchell Starc did, what Mitchell Johnson did. They're really obvious, their skills. They're almost one-dimensional is the wrong way of putting it, but it's like, oh, they're good because of this. Whereas with Rabada, he could swing it, but he could seam it, and he's fast, and he can put the ball where he wants to, but he's not that accurate, and he's not that tall. He's got a little bit of all these different things. And I wonder if that is one of if you take those two main things we've talked about, the variety of the pitches, the fact that they're maybe a bit like the old West Indies days, we have especially now, where you have pitches that spin in South Africa even more so, right? So you have all this variety, and then they're not throwing the ball to the spinners. So you have to be able to bowl that third and fourth big spell. Whereas in Australia, even if you've just got an average spinner in your team, you're probably going to get them to do the bulk of the work, and the quicks will go at the other end. So there does feel to me to be a unique situation when it comes to conditions, but also the mindset around pace is important, and spin bowling is salad. Sorry to go back to the Royal meeting the Afrikaners bit there, but you know what I mean.
No, I like that. Spin bowling is salad. Well, we got some of the best vegans in our history with Keshav Maharaj and Simon Harmer knocking about. Although I can assure you, Simon Harmer is not a vegetarian. But yeah, Jade, it's an interesting.
But just to go on that. Yeah, that's all in the last couple of years when the pitches have changed again, though, isn't it? Right. So
quite right.
But
the fast bowling heritage. I mean, you could argue, had Paul Adams not broken his finger, he may have left a greater impression on world cricket. I don't buy the theory that batters had worked him out. He was still developing variation by the time he broke his finger, and he just got a 9 for in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or somewhere. So I think he could have carried on. Maybe that's a conversation for another time. But I suppose just getting back to the conversation I had with Alan Donald. I beg your pardon. This was with Vincent Barnes, the high performance manager for South Africa, who has worked as a fast bowling coach at various levels. And he said something interesting, that every South African spinner I've spoken to has always bemoaned the fact that when they were growing up, they'd bowl one bad over, and a bad over is just one that goes for 10, let's say. Not even one that gets tonked for many. But if you get hit for double figures in an over, the likelihood of your captain or coach pulling you off, and I'm talking about between the ages of 13 and 17, let's say, are really high. A fast bowler, if you know he can bowl quick, can almost get hit for 6-4s. But you'll still toss him the ball as long as he was bowling quick. If he was bowling half bangers and getting pulled, or he was bowling full half volleys and getting driven, but they were at gas, that's fine. In pace we trust. if he's bowling line and length and going at, I don't know, 7, 8 and over, but it's not very quick. Okay, well, he's not taking wickets. Well, what is the spin? What is the seamer doing? We don't really understand him. I mean, that's why. I mean, Vernon Philander probably should have had an extra 4 years of international cricket. He should have been in the side 4 years earlier. He just had to get 1 million wickets in domestic cricket before it's like, all right, fine, we'll get this chubby slow bowler into the side because we have to. But if Vernon Philander was doing those numbers at pace, we would be talking about a prodigy, right? But instead, it's even now, so when South African cricket fans come up with their best 11 since readmission, some people still don't have Vernon Philander in the side because he wasn't quick, because he wasn't knocking guys' heads off. So there is a mindset in South African sport, but we'll talk about cricket, where, to steal a line from another podcast, you got to be the alpha. You got to be the macho guy. You got to be Graham Smith with your chest out, and you got to have a nickname like Biff and stick your chin out and look at the Aussie journalists and tell them that you're going to come and kick their back door in. You got to be Jacques Cullis, who catches pigeons and speaks out of the side of his mouth. You got to be Dale Steyn, who does the chainsaw celebration. You can't just be a dibbly-dobbling, consistently probing bowler unless you're also bowling quick. And it's a great shame. I mean, I'm kind of talking myself in circles here, but I do think of Vernon Philander's career and think, well, can you imagine that? Can you imagine he was English or even Australian? I think Australia probably has more of a, well, if he was Australian, he probably wouldn't have made it on the domestic scene. But if he was a Kiwi or English or from any other country, I think he would have had a longer career. And it's a shame because he was obviously spectacular. So, Jarrod, I've completely forgotten if there was a question there. Maybe you can help me out.
This is just you and I chatting. This is just you and I riffing. No, I think that's interesting because I think Australia probably missed out on Chad Sayers and probably missed out on other skillful bowlers in their time. But they had the ability to pick someone like Josh Hazlewood. And Josh Hazlewood is basically Shaun Pollock, right? Slightly different bowlers in that, one's a swing bowler and one's more of a seam bowler. And Josh Hazlewood's maybe almost a combination between Shaun Pollock and Glenn McGrath. But, Josh Hazlewood started as a very quick bowler and sort of worked his way back, whereas McGrath was probably never that quick. And Shaun Pollock did a similar thing, slightly different than Hazlewood. But Hazlewood having those skills at that pace is the sort of thing you see in it's what we're talking about, Dale Steyn. So I would say that Pat Cummins is probably the most skillful and accurate fast bowler we've ever had, right? But the two that come to mind before then are both South African, and that's Alan Donald and Dale Steyn. And the only reason they're not as accurate as Pat Cummins is because they swung the ball. And he seams it, and it's much easier to be accurate when you seaming it because you don't have to worry about it, leaving your hand. And we know that was one of Donald's big problems at times. But I think that's what South Africa are going towards is probably what Australia have gone to, almost separate. It hasn't been inspired by South Africa because they would never admit it, even if it was true. But that whole thing of trying to combine 90 mile an hour with that skill is probably why you see 4 South Africans in that list that you were talking about before of the top seam bowlers in the world, because they do have the ability to combine a couple of different skills at the same time. You talked to Alan Donald for this piece. His background would be vastly different, well, certainly than Mackay and Teeny's, but then a lot of other people here. So is it something to do with the school systems and the training? I would assume, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Dale Steyn and Vernon Philander both went to mid-level South African schools rather than the high schools. And Morne Morkel, it comes completely outside of the school system. But the majority of the fast bowlers probably still went through the school system at one point. Certainly Rabada and Donald did.
Yeah, Ngidi as well. I don't think Henrik Nokia, and I believe that Jansen did. I stand to be corrected on Jansen. Certainly Kesha Maharaj did. Yeah, I mean, the school system's an interesting one. Certainly a massive reliance on the school system. Certainly for the batters, much like here in the UK, where I'm based, but there's a difference because, according to Tim Wigmore and in his excellent book, Crickenomics, he shows that there is a disparity between the reliance between batting and bowling and their reliance on the elite schools. In South Africa, that reliance on the elite schools is still the same for batters and bowlers. Conditions, nutrition, gym work, but also just a exposure. I think a lot of selectors, and Vincent Barnes has told me this as well, is that you go to these trials and there'll be a guy bowling at, I don't know, 120 at age group level, 125 at age group level. The first thing someone's going to ask is, what school does he go to? Not how many wickets did he get? What club does he play for? It's what school does he go to? And so often, if that answer is not the right one, that person doesn't really get a look in. They'll really have to tear the house down and get a set. For every 7 wickets that person takes, the person who went to the private school can take 4, for example. So I think there's still an elite school bias. But Jad, I just want to kind of remind the listeners that it wasn't that long ago that South Africa were the last time South Africa played England, when England came and won 3-1 in South Africa. The bowling lineup for that 4th test was an aging Vernon Philander, who probably should have already been on his way out. Björn Hendricks, who got tonked. Arnick Nokia, who took his first 5 in that match. Dane Patterson, who got tonked. And Dwayne Pretorius, who was a handy seamer. But, he's no Marco Jansen, is he? So,
5th bowler, yeah.
As the 5th bowler, yeah, that's right. But if we're going to look at the 4, Philander, Hendricks, Nokia, Patterson. Yes, Rabada was out because he screamed in Joe Root's face in Port Elizabeth, and Ngidi was injured. But there isn't this great dirt. There was, at least then, people were asking, well, what has happened to South Africa's pace battery? Where are the likes of Steyn and Donald and Pollock? Is this the end of a great tradition? So it kind of helps when you've got a young kid who's 2 meters tall and bowls with the left arm and can bring it back into the right hander. That completely rounds it up. You've got Kagiso Rabada, who is at the peak of his powers. He's still screaming, but just not in people's faces. You've got Lungi Ngidi, who's really shorn up his fitness. I think Ngidi stopped trying to be lean and just embraced that he's a heavy dude. And he's fine. I'll be the bowler with the big bum and the big thighs, but I'll just watch what I eat and I'll make sure that my core stays strong. He doesn't have to be lean and lithe. And Arnick Nokia, who I think has surprised a lot of people, myself included, and become the skillful bowler that he is. We always knew he was going to be quick, but I mean, he isn't just this brute who bowls fast. He's got an IPL gig. You don't get that from just bowling fast. You got to have a slower ball. You got to have a knuckle ball. You got to have a back of the hand ball. You got to be able to vary your length, which Nokia does now very well. So it'd be remiss of me to say, oh well, this is just an inevitable progression of South Africa's great heritage. Golden generations are sometimes the result of luck, and if we are in the midst of what, look, the FTP might have something to say about this, but if we are in the midst of or at the start of what would be a golden generation of South African fast bowling, it is as much of a consequence of luck and fortune and timing as it is South Africa's great heritage.
Yeah, one thing I would just add to that, of course, is they probably missed out on what Kyle Abbott, Dwayne Olivier, Marchant de Lang. I know he's, but there was probably a what would you say? The second tier bowlers, when Rabada is injured and Ngidi is injured, was a problem back then. But you're not wrong. I still think though, a couple of years ago, you and I were probably sitting down going, where does this South African team go? There's still kind of no batting. It's not bad batting, but it's thin and it feels like it can fall apart at any stage. They're playing 5 frontline bowlers, which is worked in that last test, obviously, but is not probably a consistent way of winning going forward. They brought Pretorius back, and now they seem a little bit unsure in him. And to be honest, I'm not sure he shores up the number 7 batting position any more than Marco Janssen's dodgy batting does. So the actual team is still a little bit up and down. But you do look at that bowling lineup, and it doesn't matter what format of bowling you're looking at, and you're just like, well, whether it be the spinners or the pace bowlers, there's a lot there to choose from. And I want to go back to Nokia because I find him really, really interesting. First time I saw him bowl, I must have seen him bowl a couple of spells in India, and he bowled absolutely gun barrel straight at about 90 miles an hour in the heat. And I was like, okay, he does that. I watched him in the IPL this year. He bowled, I'm trying to remember all the different, he bowled a back of the hand slow ball, a cutter, trying to remember if he bowled a knuckleball as well. I think he's got another slower ball.
He's got a knuckleball. Maybe he didn't bowl it then, but he definitely has one.
I think he's got the knuckleball since then. I think you're right. He bowls a wobble ball. He could swing it. Every time I watch him bowl, he's got an added skill set. And I feel like there's something within the training of all these guys. So I've got the list here, right? So Alan Donald, Dale Steyn, Sean Pollock, Mackay Ntini, Rabada, Vernon Philander. That's just off the top of my head. I probably missed a couple of very good ones there. Outside of Ntini, who probably was bowling, he was bowling wide of the crease well before it was in fashion, and it turns out now it's the better way to bowl. So we now maybe that explains a lot of his success. Almost everyone else there has incredible skill, right? And that is something that I don't think, if you look at Mitchell Starc and Mitchell Johnson, so two supremely talented bowlers who've won Australia big events and big moments, you wouldn't say that either of them completely knew what they were doing, right? And Australia's the other, now that the West Indies have passed on, Australia's the other fast bowling place, right? West Indies not the same, and Pakistan has moments and sort of flashes, but maybe consistently not always there. So Australia and South Africa are kind of there at the front. The Australian fast bowlers seem to be incredibly tall, and they seem to have, as I said before, specific skills. The interesting thing is that from Alan Donald all the way through to, well, I suppose Nortje at the moment, just the incredible skills. Even if you compare Marco Jansen to Bruce Reid, Marco Jansen seems to have everything that Bruce Reid has, plus an extra yard of pace, plus he can swing the ball more, right? They just keep getting these little things. So if it's not schooling and it's not completely conditions based, what do you think it is about the South African bowling setup since readmission that has allowed for this? How much of this is Alan Donald there weren't many 90-mile-an-hour bowlers before Alan Donald to begin with. And with all, due respect to some of the 90-mile-an-hour bowlers before him, outside of maybe someone like Malcolm Marshall, Michael Holding, very few of them were skillful. Donald was a proper skillful bowler, even if the white ball sometimes slipped out of his fingers.
Geez, Jarrod, that is a fantastic question. And I think
there's a whole article for that.
It is a whole article for that. Without dipping into the weird and problematic subject of eugenics, and also that's completely irrelevant because South Africa, as you said, are completely multicultural and multiracial. There is just something about the South African weather, the open spaces, our cities are big, but the schools are sort of dotted around in the suburbs where there's just enough people to make it competitive, but not too many that talent gets lost in the ecosystem. It's almost a perfect breeding ground for talent. And someone will come and develop a slow ball, and there'll be enough people that will see, okay, well, if that guy's, and this I'm talking about at school level now. Someone at Kes, for example, starts bowling a slow ball and it gets the top order of St. John's, two big schools in Johannesburg. Someone slow ball runs through St. John's. That St. John's bowler is going to think, oh, okay, I like that. He's going to go away to his academy, and then there'll be the guy from St. Stithians who will see that. And then that guy from St. Stithians will go and play a week down in Durban, and the guy at Durban High School will see it. The elite schools rub shoulders just enough that there's a transaction of ideas, and they're pushing each other, almost like how why was the old Roman Republic so good? Because these young aristocrats were hungry and just wanted to be at the top of the food chain, and I think that's the case with South African sport, and we value that. In South African society, you can go to a first 15 rugby match on a Saturday morning, and there'll be more people watching that than will be watching the professional team, the Lions, at Ellis Park Rugby Stadium. Cricket at school doesn't have the same cachet, but it's not too far behind. It matters. People look at the scorecards. Oh, Graham Smith went to King Edward and he made X amount of runs. Well, I'm going to send my son to King Edward because I want him to be the next Graham Smith. There's an importance. There's a self-aggrandizing mythology around the school system and the school ecosystem and the school infrastructure that is aided by the weather, that is aided by the wide open spaces, that is aided by something that distinguishes from England, that the elite schools in South Africa aren't necessarily from the upper crust. They're not necessarily wealthy. There are a lot of state schools like King Edward, like Durban High School that Kesha Maharaj went to. I'm trying to think of the ones in Cape Town. There are many Pretoria boys, Affies, that AB and Fuff and Heino Kun went to. That's a state school. So you even though you're pulling from quite a thin pool, as it were, you are pulling from working class kids, from the farm, kids from the township who are fortunate enough to get a scholarship. So I think that melding of ideas churns out different sorts of players. We think of like the England top order batters. They all seem very cookie cutter, and it's like England are just hoping that one of the 100 kids that graduate from this year, one of them will have natural gifts because we've all pushed them through the same mold. Whereas I think what South African school system does is that it produces many talented players who are very different from each other. So yes, you can look at Rabada and Ngidi and Nokia and Janssen, and they all do what they do very well, but they're all very different. If every single Kagiso Rabada is an absolute superstar, but if all 4 bowlers were doing the exact same thing, that would diminish his potency. And I think that's partly England's problem. There's just too many players who are good but sort of do the same thing. That's why they're so reliant on Stokes, Bairstow, Root, because they do something different. Their bowling is basically the same. So I think there's something about the South African system that it promotes talent, but it does so in different ways, and it has room for the tall lefty that brings it in, for Ngidi's sort of nibbly, wobbly back of the length stuff, for Nokia's rapid pace, and for Rabada's, well, he does everything well, but we don't know exactly what he is. He's just good. So I think that school system definitely deserves a lot of credit.
Well, it's interesting because outside of probably modern Australian cricket, I don't think there are that many fast bowling systems, if that makes sense. So Australia over the last 15, 20 years certainly gone towards that. After struggling to find fast bowlers for a long time, to be fair as well, the late 80s, early 90s, not getting as many fast bowlers, and then sort of, Gillespie and Lee comes on, and then on the back of that you get Cummins and Pattinson and, Stark and Mitchell Johnson and Ryan Harris. But mostly, in most cricket cultures, fast bowlers kind of come from outside the main hubs of cricket, right? So if you think in England, you have to come from the north to begin with, and you probably have to be working class, whereas the batters are probably more from the south and, more privately educated. In places like Sri Lanka, they find kids on the beach. In South Africa, in India and Pakistan, again, it's kids on the street, right? I wonder if South Africa, the reason that it's a combination of the fast bowlers is obviously the physicality. It's obviously the pitches, right? That those two things have to help. And we haven't even talked about the fact that, fast bowlers have a lower average in South Africa than anywhere else yet. But those things all make sense. But then that matching with skill. And if you think of like Mackay and Tini and Morne Morkel might be two of the, I don't want to say less skilled and like sound like I'm sledging them, because what they both did was incredible. But they were sort of like, they were skilled in a particular way that helped them get a lot of test wickets, whereas they probably didn't have the ability to swing the ball in and out whenever they needed to, and bowl a cutter and bowl all those different kinds of deliveries, right? Those have come from completely outside of any sort of schooling system, right? And yet most of the others have at one stage or another gone to a school with probably a good cricket master, probably good conditions, where it's passed on in a way that before Australia really started picking, finding 15-year-olds who could bowl 80 miles an hour, they didn't really have that kind of system. So it is even a unique system separate to Australia in that there is something there, and it's not accidental. And that's why I go back to Nokia. And you can put Rabada in this as well. It's just that he's been around for longer. But their ability to dismiss you with so many different skill sets. For a fast bowler, that partly this is the natural evolution of cricket, right? You see it in baseball. In the old days, you had guys who were slow and skillful, and then you had fast pitchers. And now you have the fast pitchers have incredible skills as well. So it's a natural evolution. But it does feel like this has happened in South Africa earlier on. And I don't know if it is something to do with that school system. Because the best athletes are getting access to the best training in a way that perhaps hasn't happened in other cricket cultures when you're looking at the best fast bowlers. But the whole thing is, there's no answers here, Dan. You've written a piece, you and I have talked for 40 minutes. There's no answers, but it is a fascinating subject, isn't it?
Yeah, and you know what? There's something just so primal, and I hope we never come up with with an exact answer, because there's something so primal. I mean, I love fast bowling. If I could go back and engineer my entire life, all I'd want to do is be 6'4" and be able to bowl rockets. It looks like the best thing in the world. If I could just be a fast bowler who could scare a test quality batter, that's all I want to do in my life. I don't want to play a guitar solo. I don't want to sing. I don't want to be able to run 100 meters very quick. I just want to bowl fast. Unfortunately, I've never been able to do that. And I hope, like I said, I hope we never come up with that answer, because I like that it's intangible. I like that South Africa's good at fast bowling because they are. Yes, we can get close and say, well, it's the school system, it's the weather, it's genetics, it's the South African macho aggression on the field that is a manifestation of our national insecurity. So when we're playing for our country, we want to try and forget about the rampant crime and state corruption and the lights that don't work, so we're going to knock your head off, and then we're going to bowl an in-swinger to take your stump out the ground. Perhaps that's something to do with it. I don't know. Maybe life is too good in New Zealand to produce fast bowlers. Maybe that's why Neil Wagner was the first guy who came and bowled a bumper, because he grew up in South Africa. I don't know. And like I say, it's nice that we have this bewildering, scary thing that we can look at the numbers and say, okay, well, empirically, South Africans are great at it. But unlike everything else, we can't exactly put our finger on why. And I like that.
I like that this podcast started talking about South African bowlers and ended up slagging off New Zealand for no reason. Thanks for coming on.
No worries. Always happy to come on.